person who hurts you the most rarely raises their voice. They smile. They compliment you. They remember your birthday. And somewhere in that warmth, they are taking something from you, piece by piece, and you will not notice until you are empty. This is the most uncomfortable truth about human nature. The people who manipulate you best are the ones who never look like manipulators at all. They look like friends, like family, like the colleague who always has your back until the moment it matters. By the end of this, you will understand the hidden architecture behind almost every relationship that has ever quietly drained you. You will learn to see the mechanics behind manipulative behavior before it touches you. And you will walk away with something rarer than intelligence. Silent confidence, the kind that cannot be manipulated, because it no longer needs anyone's approval to feel whole. Stay until the final sentence, because the last idea in this film will change how you experience every relationship you have left. Let's begin. Human beings are not honest creatures. We like to believe we are. We tell ourselves that we say what we mean, that our intentions are visible on our faces, that the people close to us can be trusted simply because time has passed and nothing bad has happened yet. But underneath nearly every interaction, there is a second conversation happening, a silent one. A negotiation of power, status, and need that most people never consciously acknowledge, not even to themselves. Consider the coworker who always asks about your weekend before asking for a favor. On the surface, it looks like warmth, but watch the pattern over months and you begin to see something else. The compliment always arrives right before the ask. The interest in your life is never separate from what your life can do for them. This is not evil in the cartoonish sense. It is something quieter and far more common. It is transactional affection, dressed as friendship. Psychologists have a term for this dynamic: reciprocity exploitation. Human beings are wired to feel indebted when someone gives us something, even something small. A compliment, a favor, a moment of listening. And the moment that debt is created in your mind, you become slightly more willing to say yes to things you would normally refuse. Manipulators, whether they know it consciously or not, understand this mechanism instinctively. They give first, so that later you feel obligated to give back your time, your loyalty, your silence about their flaws. This is the first hidden motive beneath so much of modern connection. People do not always seek relationships out of love. Sometimes they seek relationships out of leverage, and here is where it gets uncomfortable. You have done this too. Everyone has. The difference between a manipulator and an ordinary person is not the presence of self-interest. It is the ratio. The manipulator's self-interest is the entire engine. Everything else is decoration. Think of the friend who only calls when they need something. You know this pattern. You have felt the specific, sinking recognition in your stomach when their name appears on your phone and some old, tired part of you already knows what they want before they say a word. That feeling is not paranoia. That is pattern recognition, one of the oldest and most reliable instincts your mind possesses. And yet, most people override it. They silence that instinct because acknowledging it means accepting an uncomfortable truth, that someone they care about does not care back in equal measure. There is another layer to this that most people never examine: the difference between genuine generosity and strategic generosity. Genuine generosity expects nothing in return. It exists complete in itself. Strategic generosity, however, is always a deposit, made with the unspoken expectation of withdrawal later. You can usually tell the difference by watching what happens when you decline the favor. Genuine generosity shrugs and moves on. Strategic generosity turns cold, or worse, turns wounded, performing hurt feelings as a way of pulling you back into compliance. Watch how someone responds to your no. That single reaction will tell you more about their true motive than 1,000 kind words ever could. This is where the psychology of silence becomes so powerful and so misunderstood. Most people think silence is weakness, that the person who says nothing has lost the exchange. But silence, used with intention, is one of the most dominant forces in human interaction. When you stop over-explaining yourself, stop defending your choices to people who never asked in good faith, Stop filling every uncomfortable pause with reassurance. You remove the exact fuel that manipulative behavior depends on. Manipulators need reaction. They need your anxiety, your guilt, your desperate need to be understood. The moment you stop supplying that reaction, their tools stop working. This is not coldness. It is not cruelty. It is the beginning of emotional detachment. Not the detachment of someone who has stopped feeling, but the detachment of someone who has stopped auditioning for approval that was never going to be given honestly in the first place. There is a particular kind of person who thrives specifically inside your emotional reactivity, and understanding how they operate will change how you see nearly every difficult relationship in your life. There is a version of this dynamic that plays out constantly in professional life, and almost no one names it directly. The colleague who takes credit for your idea in the meeting, not by lying outright, but by rephrasing your point 3 seconds after you said it, just polished enough that the room remembers it as theirs. This is not accidental. It is a microtransaction of status, executed so quickly that objecting to it in the moment would make you look petty rather than accurate. Manipulators thrive inside this exact gap. The gap between what happened and what can be proven happened. They operate in plausible deniability, in moments too small to escalate, too subtle to confront without seeming paranoid. And that, precisely, is the design. The smallness is the protection. Let's talk about the architecture of control, because manipulation is rarely a single act. It is a system, a slow, patient construction built brick by brick until the person inside it no longer recognizes the walls around them. It almost always begins with idealization. The manipulator studies you, not maliciously at first, but instinctively, the way a predator studies terrain. They learn what you're starving for: attention, validation, a sense of being chosen, and they supply it in abundance, faster and more intensely than anyone else ever has. This is why the earliest phase of a manipulative relationship, romantic, professional, or platonic, often feels like the best relationship of your life. You are not imagining that intensity. It is real. It is simply not sustainable because it was never about you specifically. It was about what you represented. An opening. Then comes the second phase, the quiet tightening. The compliments become slightly conditional. The warmth becomes something you have to earn rather than something freely given. And here is the part almost nobody sees happening in real time. You begin adjusting yourself to keep the good version of them around. You get smaller, quieter, more agreeable. Not because they demanded it outright, but because the emotional cost of resistance has become too high and your nervous system, quietly, wisely, protectively, starts choosing the path of least conflict. This is how boundary control gets stolen without a single dramatic confrontation. You do not lose your boundaries in one catastrophic moment. You lose them in 1,000 small negotiations, each one so minor it never felt worth the fight. Think about the parent who says, "I'm only telling you this because I love you," right before delivering a comment designed to shrink you. Think about the manager who praises your work ethic publicly, then privately hints that you're replaceable the moment you ask for what you're worth. Think about the partner who says, "I just worry about you," every time you make a decision that doesn't need their approval. In every case, the words sound loving. The function is control. Here is the deeper psychological truth beneath all of this. Manipulation is rarely about hatred. It is about fear. The person exerting control over you is almost always, underneath their behavior, terrified of losing relevance in your life. Real confidence does not need to manage another person's choices. Only insecurity dressed as authority behaves that way. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior, but it does something more useful. It removes its power over you, because once you see fear instead of strength behind the manipulation, you stop mistaking control for love. There is a final phase to this architecture that deserves its own attention. The phase psychologists sometimes call intermittent reinforcement. This is the mechanism behind why so many people stay far longer than logic would suggest in relationships that clearly hurt them. It works like this. If a person treated you badly all the time, you would leave quickly. The exit would be obvious. But if that same person is cruel only some of the time, and warm, generous, even loving the rest of the time, your brain does something strange. It starts chasing the good moments the way a gambler chases a jackpot, remembering the wins vividly, minimizing the losses, convinced that if you just try a little harder, stay a little longer, the good version will return and stay for good. This is not a character flaw, it is neurology. Unpredictable reward is, quite literally, more addictive to the human brain than consistent reward, which means the very inconsistency that should be a warning sign is often the exact thing that keeps people bonded to their manipulator most tightly. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood forces in all of human psychology: the difference between real power and performed power. One is silent. The other is loud, desperate, and constantly needs an audience to confirm it exists. There is a specific kind of person who walks into a room and says almost nothing, and somehow everyone adjusts around them anyway. Not because they demanded attention, because they never needed it in the first place. This is stoic power, and it has almost nothing to do with the popular image of stoicism, the emotionless, robotic man suppressing everything he feels. Real stoic power, the kind Marcus Aurelius wrote about in his private journal, never intended for anyone else to read, is not about suppression. It is about selective response. The Stoics understood something modern psychology has only recently caught up to. You cannot control what happens to you, and you cannot control what other people choose to do, but you retain, always, complete control over your reaction. And in a world engineered to hijack your reactions for someone else's benefit, through outrage, through guilt, through manufactured urgency, the ability to pause before reacting becomes a form of dominance nobody can take from you. This is the essence of high-value mindset, not arrogance, not superiority, but a quiet, internal sovereignty. A high-value person does not need to announce their worth because their worth is not up for debate in their own mind. And this is precisely what makes them almost immune to manipulation. Manipulators search for cracks, self-doubt, unresolved guilt, a hunger for approval. When they encounter someone whose sense of self does not depend on external validation, their usual tools simply do not work. There is nothing to pull on, no lever to press. Consider two people receiving the exact same insult. The first person, whose self-worth is externally sourced, spirals, replaying the comment for days, questioning themselves, seeking reassurance from anyone who will give it. The second person, operating from internal validation, feels the sting for a moment, and then lets it pass, the way a mountain lets weather pass over it. Same insult, two entirely different outcomes. The difference was never the insult. It was the foundation it landed on. This is where self-respect becomes not just an emotional stance, but a strategic one. Self-respect is the refusal to negotiate your dignity for the comfort of someone else's ego. It sounds simple. It is one of the hardest disciplines a human being can practice, because our nervous systems are ancient, built for tribal survival, wired to fear exclusion above almost anything else. For most of human history, being cast out of the group meant death. So the instinct to appease, to shrink, to avoid conflict at any cost is not weakness. It is an inherited survival mechanism thousands of years old. But you are not living in that world anymore. And the same instinct that once kept your ancestors alive, now, in modern life, is precisely what keeps you trapped inside relationships and situations that quietly diminish you. There is a physical dimension to stoic power that rarely gets discussed, because most people assume confidence is purely mental. It is not. Watch how a genuinely secure person occupies a room. Unhurried movements, steady eye contact that does not dart away first, a voice that does not rise in pitch when challenged. Now watch someone operating from insecurity. The rapid nodding, the reflexive apologizing for taking up space, the nervous laughter that fills every silence because silence itself feels unbearable. Manipulators read these signals instantly, often without consciously naming what they are reading. Your body is speaking a language before your mouth ever opens, and it is often the first thing a predator studies before deciding whether you are worth the effort. This is not about performing confidence you do not feel. It is about understanding that regulating your nervous system, breathing slower, moving deliberately, resisting the urge to fill every pause, is itself a form of psychological armor. Recognizing this inherited wiring is the first step toward overriding it. And overriding it requires something most people avoid at all costs: the willingness to be disliked. Here is a truth almost no one says out loud. You cannot build genuine self-respect without surviving someone's disapproval. Every boundary you have ever set, every time you said no without justifying it for 20 minutes, every moment you chose your own peace over someone else's comfort, all of it required tolerating the discomfort of being seen as difficult, cold, or selfish by someone who benefited from your compliance. This is the price of boundary control, and it is non-negotiable. There is no version of self-respect that comes without friction. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a fantasy. There is also a distinction worth making here, because self-respect is often confused with its louder, more aggressive cousin. Self-respect is not the same as retaliation. It is not about winning the argument, proving the other person wrong, or extracting an apology that validates your pain. Those impulses feel satisfying in the moment, but they keep you tethered to the very person you are trying to detach from, because you are still, in some sense, performing for their reaction. Real self-respect does not need the other person to admit fault. It does not need a courtroom verdict. It simply requires you to act in alignment with your own dignity, whether or not anyone else ever acknowledges what happened. This is a much quieter victory than vindication, and for that exact reason, it is a far more permanent one. Let's return to real scenarios, because abstract philosophy means nothing without application. The friend who guilt trips you for having other friends. The family member who brings up old debts of loyalty every time you assert an opinion of your own. The partner who goes cold and distant the moment you express a need, training you, slowly, invisibly, to stop expressing needs at all. These are not isolated incidents. They are strategies, whether consciously chosen or not, designed to keep you small enough to control. The way out is rarely dramatic. It is not a screaming confrontation or a viral moment of standing up for yourself. The way out is almost always quiet. A woman stops explaining why she's tired of being taken for granted and simply starts leaving the room when it happens. A man stops arguing his worth to a boss who will never see it and starts applying elsewhere in silence. A son stops trying to make a critical parent proud and instead builds a life that no longer requires that approval to feel complete. None of these moments look powerful from the outside. All of them are. This is the essence of emotional detachment done correctly. Not becoming numb to people, but becoming free from needing their validation to feel secure in who you are. Detachment is not the absence of love. It is love without dependency. You can care deeply about someone and still refuse to let their opinion of you determine your worth. In fact, that is the only sustainable way to love anyone, from a place of wholeness, not from a place of need. And this is the final, quiet paradox sitting underneath everything we have discussed. The less you need people to validate you, the more genuinely you are able to connect with them. Neediness distorts relationships. It turns other people into mirrors you are constantly checking for reassurance, instead of individuals you are actually seeing. The moment you stop needing the mirror, you finally start seeing the person. Self-mastery, in the end, is not about becoming cold, distant, or invulnerable. It is not about walking through life suspicious of everyone, cataloging every interaction for hidden motives until you trust no one at all. That is not wisdom. That is a different kind of prison. True self-mastery is the ability to stay open, stay warm, stay generous with your affection, while remaining completely unshakable in your sense of self, no matter who approves and who does not. The people who manipulate, who exploit silence, who weaponize guilt and obligation, they are not your enemies in the way you might imagine. They are, more often than not, simply operating from their own unresolved fear, repeating patterns they likely learned long before you ever entered their life. Understanding this does not mean you owe them access to you. Compassion and access are two entirely different things. You can understand someone's wound completely and still choose to close the door. Because here is the deepest truth beneath everything this film has explored. Inner peace was never meant to depend on other people behaving well. It was always meant to be something you carry with you, quietly, regardless of who walks in and out of your life. The moment your peace stops depending on anyone else's approval, behavior, or opinion of you, you become, in the truest sense, unshakable. Not because nothing can hurt you anymore, but because nothing can own you anymore. That is not coldness. That is not detachment for the sake of protection alone. That is the quiet, hard-won dignity of a person who has finally stopped auditioning for a life that was theirs all along. If this made you see your own relationships differently, there is another film waiting for you right now. One that goes even deeper into the quiet signs that someone in your life has been controlling you far longer than you realized. Watch it next, because some patterns are only visible once you know exactly where to look.